The sun did not merely shine on Red Mesa. It hammered against the earth, demanding submission from every living thing that dared to take root in the dust. It was the year 1878, and the Arizona Territory was a place where hope and despair often drank from the same whiskey bottle. Red Mesa sat precariously between the vast, unforgiving indifference of the high desert and the towering, blood-colored sandstone cliffs that gave the town its name. It was a settlement of wooden boardwalks that warped in the heat, of false front buildings trying to look more important than they were, and of a wind that never ceased. That wind carried the scent of sagebrush, dry manure, and the metallic tang of impending change. There were no train tracks yet, not a single rail or spike, but the phantom sound of a steam whistle already haunted the dreams of every man with a coin in his pocket. The railroad was coming. Everyone said so. It was the promise that kept the saloon keepers pouring watered-down beer and the land speculators awake at night, staring at maps by the light of kerosene lamps. In the back room of the dusty general store, which doubled as the town's only dressmaking shop, Mara Quinn sat by the window, fighting a losing battle against the glare. She was 18 years old, with hair the color of toasted wheat and eyes that held the startling clarity of a desert sky after a storm. She pushed a needle through a bolt of rough cotton, wincing slightly as the tip pricked her thumb. She did not cry out. Mara had learned long ago that making a noise rarely brought help. It usually just drew unwanted attention. "You are going to blind yourself sitting there like that. Girl!" a voice rasped from the doorway. Mara did not look up. She knew the heavy, shuffling tread of her father's boots, as well as she knew her own heartbeat. Jed Quinn stood in the frame, leaning against the jamb as if the gravity of the earth were particularly heavy on his side of the room. He was a man who had once been handsome, but years of bad liquor and worse luck had eroded his features like wind on sandstone. "I have to finish this shirt for Mr. Abernathy by 6 in the evening. Pa," Mara said, her voice steady. It was a good voice, low and devoid of the whine that characterized so many of the town's destitute. "He pays in silver." "Silver," Jed muttered, licking dry lips. His eyes, watery and bloodshot, darted around the small room before landing on the tin box Mara kept on the shelf. "A man could turn a single silver dollar into a fortune tonight. I can feel it. Mara, the luck is shifting. I woke up with a feeling." Mara finally looked up. Her gaze was direct, stripping away her father's bravado. "You had a feeling last week, Pa, and the week before. That feeling cost us the grocery money and your pocket watch." "That was a fluke," Jed insisted. Stepping into the room, he smelled of stale tobacco and the sour sweat of desperation. "Just $2. Mara, $2 and I will bring back 20. I swear it on your mother's grave." Mara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, a mix of pity and exhaustion that had been her constant companion since she was 12. She stood up, smoothing her apron. She was slender, but there was a wire tensile strength in her frame, forged by carrying crates at the diner and scrubbing floors when the sewing work was thin. "We need that money for rent. Pa," she said softly. "Dr. Higgins said if you do not eat properly, that cough is never going to clear." "To hell with Dr. Higgins," Jed snapped, though he lacked real fire. He slumped into a chair. "I am trapped here. Mara, we both are. This town, it eats people." He was right about that, though he failed to see he was feeding himself to it piece by piece. Mara sighed, reached into her pocket, not the tin box, which was empty anyway, and pulled out a single, dull coin. $1, she said, placing it in his trembling hand. "And do not come back until you are sober." She watched him go, his step suddenly lighter, fueled by the delusion of the next hand of cards. Mara turned back to the window. She touched the hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her petticoat. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of velvet, were $42.50. It was her freedom fund. Her goal was simple and desperate: $50. With $50, she could buy a ticket on the stagecoach to Santa Fe, rent a small room for a month, and buy enough fabric to start a real shop, a place where the sign would read M. Quinn, seamstress, and no one would know her father was the town drunk. She wanted a life where the horizon wasn't blocked by red cliffs and red debts. Across town, in the only brick building Red Mesa boasted, Silas Crowley stood before a large map pinned to his wall. The First National Bank smelled of furniture polish and expensive cigars, the scent of power. Crowley was a man who wore his wealth like armor. His suits were tailored in St. Louis. His vests were silk, and his hands were soft, unblemished by the labor that broke the other men in town. He was handsome in a predatory way, with a smile that stopped exactly at his mouth, never reaching his eyes. Those eyes were currently fixed on a specific jagged line drawn in charcoal across the map. "It is the only viable route," Crowley said, tapping the paper with a manicured finger. "The engineers confirmed it yesterday. To avoid the canyon dip and the unstable shale to the north, the track has to cut right through the valley floor." Standing behind him was the sheriff, a thick-necked man named Bassett, who preferred letting others do the thinking. "That is the Greyhawk land. Silas, you know that." "I know it is waste ground," Crowley corrected smoothly. "Dry, rocky, full of rattlesnakes and ghosts. It is worth 10 cents an acre on a good day." "But it has the spring," Bassett grunted. "And that pile of rocks he prays to." Crowley turned, his expression tightening. "It is progress. Sheriff, the railroad brings civilization. It brings commerce. It brings the future to this godforsaken dust bowl. Are we to let the progress of the entire American West be halted by one stubborn savage who refuses to understand the value of a dollar? He is not just a savage, Silas. He is a Red Hawk warrior. Or was. Folks say he is crazy. Say he talks to the wind." "He is a pauper," Crowley said dismissively. "The poorest man in Red Mesa. He lives in a shack that a strong gust would knock over. Every man has a price. Sheriff, I just have not found the right currency for him yet. But I will. I have buyers lined up in Chicago who are already printing brochures for the Red Mesa Resort and Township. I will not let a half-breed stand in the way of my destiny." Crowley walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. He watched a tumbleweed roll past the saloon. He didn't see the town as it was. He saw what he could sell it for. He needed that deed. And Silas Crowley had never met a thing he couldn't buy or steal. The mid-afternoon heat had driven most sensible people indoors, leaving the main street eerily quiet when the rider appeared at the edge of town. He did not ride a glossy stallion with silver tack. He rode a Mustang, a coat of dappled gray that blended with the desert sage, moving with a fluid, silent grace that spoke of wild origins. The horse wore no saddle, only a simple blanket and a hackamore rope woven from horsehair. The man on the horse's back sat with a posture so upright he looked like a statue carved from mahogany. Talon Greyhawk. He wore buckskin breeches that had seen years of wear, mended with careful, functional stitching. His shirt was simple cotton, faded to the color of bone, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle. His hair, black as a raven's wing and streaked with the dust of the trail, hung long and loose, held back from his face by a strip of leather. As he guided the Mustang down the center of the street, the activity on the boardwalks paused. Conversations died. A woman sweeping her porch stopped and pulled her child behind her skirts. Men whittling on benches spat tobacco juice into the dirt and narrowed their eyes. The hostility was palpable, a physical weight in the air. To them, he was a reminder of the wars they wanted to forget, a specter of the people they had displaced. They called him the Poor Indian, the Dirt Scratcher, mocking his refusal to live on the reservation, mocking the barren patch of land he clung to at the edge of the cliffs. Talon looked at none of them. His face was a mask of stoic indifference, high cheekbones casting sharp shadows in the afternoon sun. His eyes, dark and impenetrable, stayed fixed on the horizon until he reached the feed store. He slid from the horse's back in one fluid motion. He did not tie the animal. A quiet word in a language older than the town itself was all the command the Mustang needed to stand ground. Talon entered the store. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, a stark contrast to the silence that followed his entry. The shopkeeper, a balding man named Higgins' brother to the doctor, stiffened behind the counter. "We do not give credit to your kind, Greyhawk," Higgins said loudly, playing to the audience of two farmers standing by the cracker barrel. Talon placed a small leather pouch on the counter. He opened it, revealing a small pile of coins, pennies, nickels, a few dimes. It was not much, but it was legal tender. 10 pounds of seed corn, Talon said. His voice was deep, resonating in the quiet store like a drumbeat. His English was perfect, unaccented, a fact that often unsettled the locals more than if he had spoken in broken pidgin. And a bag of coffee, Higgins sneered, but took the money. He counted it slowly, deliberately making Talon wait. You are short 3 cents for the coffee. Talon did not argue. He did not beg. He simply reached out his hand, his long fingers steady. Then keep the coffee, just the seed. He waited while Higgins weighed the corn, his back straight, ignoring the whispers of the farmers behind him. Look at him, proud as a peacock with nothing but a dirt floor to sleep on. Heard Crowley offered him $500 for that rock pile he lives on. Fool turned it down. 500. For that I would sell my mother for 500. Talon took the sack of seed, slung it over his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and walked out. He felt the eyes on his back, the mixture of fear and loathing. They hated him because he was different, but they despised him because he was poor and yet refused to bow. He possessed a dignity that their money could not purchase, and that infuriated them. Mara had finished the shirt and was hurrying toward the diner for her evening shift when she saw him. She paused on the boardwalk, clutching her shawl tight against the sudden gust of wind. Talon was mounting his horse. For a second, the crowd on the street parted, and she saw him clearly. She had seen him before, of course. Red Mesa was a small town, but usually he was a silhouette on the ridge or a fleeting shadow at the edge of the market. Today, the sun caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the weary set of his shoulders. He looked lonely. It was a thought that surprised her. Mara was used to seeing men as threats or burdens. Her father was a burden. The men at the saloon were threats. Silas Crowley, who tipped his hat to her with slimy courtesy, was a vulture. But Talon Greyhawk looked like the lone pine tree that grew out of the granite on the north face, isolated, battered by the elements, but enduring. As he turned the gray Mustang to leave, his gaze swept across the boardwalk. For a heartbeat, his eyes met hers. Mara expected hardness. She expected the anger of a man treated like a stray dog. Instead, she saw a profound stillness. He did not leer at her like the cowboys did. He did not look through her like the rich wives did. He saw her, and in that brief connection, Mara felt a strange shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. It was a recognition of shared solitude. They were both trapped in Red Mesa, watching the world wait for a train that would change everything. He blinked, breaking the connection, and nudged his horse into a trot, disappearing into the cloud of red dust rising from the road. "Stay away from that one, Mara," a voice warned. Mara jumped. Silas Crowley had stepped out of the bank, standing just a few feet away. He was brushing an invisible speck of dust from his lapel. "He is dangerous," Crowley said, his voice oily with mock concern. "A relic of a savage past. It is a shame, really. He sits on land that could benefit this entire community, holding back the tide of civilization out of spite." Mara looked at the banker. She hated the way his eyes lingered on her bodice. "He seemed peaceful enough. Mr. Crowley, he was just buying seed." Crowley chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Seed for a harvest that will never come. The man is destitute. Mara, he has nothing. No future, no legacy, just pride in rocks." Crowley stepped closer, encroaching on her personal space. "It is a terrible thing to be poor in a world that is moving so fast. Isn't it your father? I saw him heading toward the Golden Nugget Saloon earlier. I worry about him. Mara, debts are a heavy chain." The threat was veiled, but it was there. Mara stiffened. "My father manages his own affairs. Mr. Crowley, does he?" Crowley smiled, showing teeth that looked too white. "Well, let us hope his luck holds. For your sake. The town is changing. My dear, Those who cannot pay their way will find themselves left behind in the dust, just like our friend Greyhawk. He tipped his hat and walked away toward the saloon, leaving Mara standing in the wind. Night fell over Red Mesa, bringing a chill that seeped into the bones. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, pierced by stars so bright they looked like ice chips. Out in the valley, 3 miles from town, Talon sat by a small fire outside his lodge. It was not a teepee, but a small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs and adobe mud, blending into the landscape. He roasted a rabbit he had caught earlier. It was a meager meal, but he ate with gratitude. Around him, the darkness was alive. He could hear the coyotes singing to the moon and the soft stamping of his horses in the corral. He had 3 horses now, the gray, a paint mare, and a young colt. They were his wealth. He looked toward the dark shape of the sacred mound rising behind his cabin. It was a small hill, topped with jagged red stones that his ancestors believed were the petrified bones of the first thunderbirds. Beneath that hill ran the spring water that never went dry, even in the harshest drought. Crowley wanted it. The railroad wanted it. They saw a water station for their steam engines. They saw a flat route for their steel rails. Talon saw the blood of his grandfather. He saw the place where he had buried his umbilical cord, binding him to this earth forever. "They will come," he whispered to the fire. He knew it. He had seen the way the banker looked at him today. The patience was running out. The offer of $500 had been an insult, but the next offer might come from the barrel of a gun. Talon reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch that hung around his neck. Inside was a single white feather and a stone he had found as a boy. He was the last guardian. The tribe had been scattered, sent to reservations where the spirit died slowly of starvation and whiskey. He had stayed. He had fought the government with their own papers, claiming citizenship, claiming a homestead, using the white man's laws to hold the red man's land. But laws were just paper, and paper burned easily. In the Golden Nugget Saloon, the air was thick enough to chew. Smoke swirled in the yellow light of the chandeliers. A piano player hammered out a tune that sounded manic and fragile. Jed Quinn sat at a round table in the corner. His face was slick with sweat. His hands shook as he held his cards. Across from him sat a professional gambler from Tombstone, a man with cold eyes and a derringer up his sleeve. And watching from the bar, sipping a glass of imported brandy, was Silas Crowley. "I will raise you," Jed croaked, pushing a pile of chips into the center. "You are out of chips." "Quinn," the gambler said flatly. "I have credit," Jed said, looking around wildly. "Ask anyone. I'm good at it." The bartender looked away, wiping a glass. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. Crowley set his glass down and walked over. The sound of his boots on the floorboards cut through the murmur of the crowd. "I will cover his bet," Crowley said softly. Jed looked up, relief flooding his face, making him look pathetic and small. "Thank you, Silas. You are a true friend. I know I can win this hand. I have a feeling." "I am sure you do." "Jed," Crowley said. He placed a stack of gold coins on the table. $50. The room went quiet. $50 was a month's wages for a cowboy. It was a fortune. "But," Crowley added, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Jed could hear, "if you lose, Jed, we will have to discuss collateral. The bank cannot keep extending charity." "I won't lose," Jed insisted, his eyes fixed greedily on the gold. "Not this time." Crowley smiled that shark-like smile. "Play." Back in her small room behind the dress shop, Mara lay on her narrow cot, listening to the wind howl. She clutched the velvet bundle to her chest. $42.50. She did not know that across town, the final card was being turned over. She did not know that the future she was saving for was about to be gambled away on a pair of jacks. She only knew that the wind sounded like a warning, crying out the names of the lost and the forgotten, spinning a web that would bind the seamstress, the gambler, the banker, and the warrior together in a knot that only violence or love could untie. The train whistle was still imaginary, but the collision was already inevitable. The silence that fell over the poker table at the Golden Nugget Saloon was heavier than a coffin lid. The discordant plinking of the banjo in the corner stuttered and died, as if the musician sensed that the air in the room had suddenly become too thin to carry a tune. Jed Quinn stared at the cards in his hand. They were garbage. A pair of threes and nothing else. Across the green felt, the professional gambler from Tombstone laid down a full house. Aces over eights. The dead man's hand, rearranged into a killing blow. Jed felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him lightheaded. He looked at the center of the table. There was no money left there. The pot had already been swept away. What remained was the invisible weight of the markers he had signed. That brings the total to $300. Quinn, Silas Crowley said. The banker did not shout. He did not need to. He sat in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who owned the building, the whiskey, and the souls of half the men in the room. He took a sip of his brandy, his eyes glittering like polished obsidian in the smoky mist. 300, Jed stammered. He wiped a trembling hand across his mouth. Silas, you know I am good for it. I just need time. A week, maybe 2. You do not have 2 weeks. Jed, Crowley said softly. You do not have 2 minutes. Crowley stood up, brushing imaginary lint from his silk vest. He signaled to the sheriff. Bassett, who had been leaning against the bar nursing a warm beer. Bassett pushed off the wood and lumbered over, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. Debtor's prison is not a pleasant place in the summer heat, Crowley mused, looking down at Jed with mock pity. And with your lungs, well, I suppose it would be a short sentence, one way or another. Jed began to weep. It was a pathetic, wet sound that made the other patrons look away in embarrassment. My girl, he choked out. If I go away, who looks after Mara? Crowley's smile sharpened. Ah, yes, the girl. At that precise moment, the saloon doors swung open. The desert night pushed in, carrying the scent of sage and cooling sand. Talon Greyhawk stepped across the threshold. The room reacted instantly. Men shifted in their chairs, turning their backs. The bartender reached for the shotgun under the counter, but left it there. Talon ignored them all. He looked as he always did, like a hawk forced to walk among chickens. He wore the dust of the trail on his buckskins, and his presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He walked straight to the bar, bypassing the poker table. I am looking for a buyer, Talon said, his voice deep and resonant. The gray mare. She is young, strong. I need the money for seed. The bartender sneered. We do not trade horses here. Indian. Try the stable in the morning. The stable master offered $5, Talon said, his jaw tight. She is worth $20. Silas Crowley's voice cut through the room. He turned from the weeping Jed Quinn to the stoic warrior. That is a high price for a pony that has never seen a shoe. Talon turned slowly to face the banker. She is sound, and she is fast. Crowley tapped his chin, his mind working rapidly. He saw the pieces of the board clearly now. On one side, a desperate drunk with a debt he could never pay. On the other, a stubborn obstacle holding onto the land the railroad needed. And in the middle, a girl. I have a proposition, Crowley said, loud enough for the room to hear. He walked around the table, positioning himself between Jed and Talon. A way to solve everyone's problems. He looked at Talon. You need money. But more than that, you need legitimacy. Don't you, Greyhawk? You need the town to stop treating you like a trespasser on your own land. Talon said nothing, his dark eyes narrowing. Crowley turned to Jed. And you? Jed, you need your debt erased. $300. Gone. Poof! Jed looked up, hope warring with confusion in his watery eyes. How? You give him the girl, Crowley said. The silence this time was absolute. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Excuse me, Talon asked, his voice dropping an octave, dangerous and low. Jed gives you his daughter, Mara, in marriage, Crowley explained smoothly, spreading his hands as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. In exchange, I absorb Jed's debt. I will write it off completely. And you, Greyhawk, you get a wife, a white wife. According to the territorial laws, a man with a legally wedded wife from the community is entitled to certain homestead protections. It would make it much harder for anyone to question your claim to that valley. It was a lie. Partially, Crowley knew that marrying Mara would actually bind Talon to the town's civil statutes, creating a paper trail Crowley could manipulate later to seize the land. But it sounded like a benefit. "I do not buy women," Talon said coldly. He turned to leave. "Wait." Crowley's voice hardened. "If you walk out that door, Greyhawk, Jed goes to jail tonight. And the girl, she has no money. She has no home. She is legally responsible for her father's outstanding accounts if he is incapacitated." Crowley leaned in, his voice dropping to a serpent's hiss. "Miss Alma has been looking for fresh faces at her establishment down the street. 18 is a prime age. Mara could work off the debt there. It might take her, 5 or 6 years on her back." Talon stopped. His hand twitched toward the knife at his belt, then stopped. He looked at Jed. The older man was shaking, his face buried in his hands. But he was not saying no. He was not fighting it. The saloon doors creaked open again. This time, it was not a customer. Mara stood there. She had come to drag her father home, her apron still on, her face pale with exhaustion. She had heard the last part. She had heard everything. She looked at her father. "Pa," she whispered. Jed refused to look at her. "I have no choice. Mara," he mumbled into his palms. "It is $300. They will kill me." Mara felt the world tilt on its axis. The smell of stale beer and sweat became nauseating. She looked at Silas Crowley, who was smiling like a man who had just won a prize. She looked at the sheriff, who looked bored. And then she looked at the prospect of Miss Alma's house, the red curtains, the drunken laughter, the slow death of the soul. Then she looked at Talon. He stood apart from them all, a pillar of stone in a mudslide. He was looking at her, and for the second time that day, she saw no leering, no pity. She saw anger, yes, but it was directed at Crowley, not her. He looked horrified by the transaction. Yet he had not walked away. Mara took a breath. It shuddered in her chest, but her chin went up. The stubbornness that had kept her sewing until her fingers bled flared to life. She walked past Crowley, ignoring him completely. She walked past her father, her skirts brushing his leg, but she did not touch him. She stopped in front of Talon Greyhawk. He was tall. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He smelled of wood smoke, horse, and the clean, sharp scent of rain on dry land. "I am not a horse to be traded," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "And I am not a chip in a poker game." "No," Talon said softly. "You are not, but I will not go to Miss Alma's." She continued, her eyes locked with his. "And I will not belong to a bank." She extended her hand, palm open. It was a gesture of agency, not submission. "If you take me," Mara said, "at least I do not belong to them." Talon looked at her hand. He looked at the fire in her eyes, a reflection of his own defiance. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was rough, calloused, and warm. "Done," Talon said to Crowley, without looking at the banker. "Clear the debt. Draw the papers." The wedding took place at 10 o'clock the next morning. It was a hurried, joyless affair in the small wooden church that smelled of beeswax and judgment. The preacher, a thin man with a nervous tic in his left eye, rushed through the verses as if he were afraid God might strike the building down for conducting such a union. Jed Quinn was not there. He was presumably passed out in a horse trough somewhere, having celebrated his liberation from debt with a fresh bottle. Mara wore her best dress, a simple blue calico that she had sewn herself. It was clean, but faded. She held no flowers. Talon stood beside her, stiff and silent. He had washed his shirt and braided his hair with a fresh leather thong, but he still looked like a wolf drafted into a parlor game. When the preacher asked for the ring, there was an awkward pause. Talon reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring fashioned from polished copper wire, something he must have made in the dark hours of the morning. He slid it onto Mara's finger. It was warm. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher mumbled, closing his Bible with a snap. "You may go." He did not say, "Kiss the bride." He did not offer a blessing. They walked out into the blinding sunlight. A group of townspeople had gathered across the street, whispering behind their hands. "Look at her," a woman hissed. "Sent to live in the dirt with a savage. Better than the brothel," another muttered, though the tone suggested there was little difference. Talon did not acknowledge them. He led Mara to where his horses were waiting. He lifted her effortlessly onto the back of the paint mare. "Can you ride?" he asked. It was the first thing he had said to her directly since the saloon. "Yes," Mara said, gripping the reins. "Then follow me." The ride to the valley took an hour. They left the town behind, passing through the scrubland and up the winding trail toward the red cliffs. The air grew cleaner here, stripped of the town's stagnation. Talon's home sat in the shadow of the sacred mound. It was humble, a structure of logs and mud, with a corral for the horses and a small patch of cultivated land where corn and beans struggled against the sun. But it was tidy. The ground in front of the door was swept clean. Talon dismounted and helped her down. He did not carry her over the threshold. He simply opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the cabin was one large room, partitioned by a hanging blanket. There was a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with clay pots and dried herbs. The sun began to set, painting the walls in shades of amber and blood orange. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Mara stood by the table, clutching her hands together. The reality of what she had done was crashing down on her. She was married. She was miles from town. She was alone with a man she did not know, a man the town called a dangerous warrior. She remembered the whispers of the women at the diner. "They are wild men. They take what they want. You will be broken before morning." Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Talon moved around the cabin, lighting a kerosene lamp. The soft yellow glow pushed back the shadows. He removed his gun belt and hung it on a peg by the door. Then he turned to her. He saw the fear. It was written in the rigidity of her spine, the way she chewed her lower lip, the way her eyes darted to the bed in the corner, a frame of pine wood piled high with furs and a woven blanket. He walked toward her. Mara flinched, taking a half step back. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. She had made a bargain. She had sold herself to save her dignity. But now the price had to be paid. She told herself she would not cry. She would endure it. "Mara?" He did not touch her. She opened her eyes. He was standing 3 feet away, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't lust. It was something sadder, deeper. He reached behind his back. Mara's breath hitched. He pulled out a knife. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing. The blade was 6 inches of chipped obsidian, sharp enough to split a hair, set into a handle of polished deer antler wrapped in leather. He held it out to her, handle first. Mara stared at it, then at him. "What is this?" "Take it," Talon said. She reached out with trembling fingers and grasped the antler handle. It felt heavy and solid. "This is yours now," Talon said. His voice was low, rumbling through the small space. "In this house, you are not a debt that has been paid. You are not a horse that has been traded." He stepped back, putting distance between them. "You are a woman," he said, "and a woman owns her own body." He pointed to the bed in the corner. "That is your place. You will sleep there. You will be warm, and you will be safe." He turned and grabbed a heavy buffalo robe from a hook on the wall. "I will sleep on the porch." Mara stood frozen, the knife clutched in her hand, the script she had written in her head, the violence, the submission, the shame had been torn to shreds. "But," she whispered. "Crowley said." "Crowley is a man who sees only numbers." Talon interrupted. "He thinks he bought me a shackle. He thinks he sold you into slavery." He walked to the door and opened it. letting in the cool night air and the sound of crickets. He paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the stars. "When you want to touch me," Talon said, not looking back at her. "If you ever want to touch me, come to me with empty hands. Come because you choose to, not because you are afraid." He stepped out and closed the door. Mara stood alone in the golden light of the lamp. She looked down at the knife in her hand. The obsidian glinted. It was a weapon of war, given as a token of peace. She walked to the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. Not because she thought he would come in, but because for the first time in her life, she had the power to decide who entered. She sat on the edge of the bed. The furs were soft, smelling of cedar and sage. Tears finally came, hot and fast, but they were not tears of terror. They were the tears of a survivor who had braced for a blow that never fell. Outside, wrapped in the buffalo robe on the hard earth of the porch, Talon listened. He heard the bolt slide home. He heard the soft weep of the girl. No, the woman inside. He stared up at the vast, indifferent Milky Way. The town will talk tomorrow. They would joke about the savage and his white bride. They would assume he had taken his prize. Let them talk. He touched the pouch at his neck. He had defended this land with arrows and bullets. Now, he would defend the girl inside with something harder to break: patience. The wind howled through the canyon, but for the first time in years, the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. A strange, dangerous, fragile home, but a home nonetheless. The morning sun did not ask for permission to enter the cabin. It simply slid through the cracks in the heavy wooden shutters, slicing the gloom with beams of dust-filled light. Mara Quinn woke with a start, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For a moment, the rough wool of the blanket beneath her chin felt alien, and the smell of the air rich with cured leather, dried sage, and the sharp tang of wood smoke was not the stale scent of her room behind the dress shop. Memory returned in a rush. The poker game, the debt, the wedding, the knife. She sat up, clutching the buffalo robe to her chest. The cabin was empty. The heavy wooden bolt on the door was unlatched, and the door stood open, framing a rectangle of blindingly blue sky. From outside, she heard a rhythmic scraping sound. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. Mara pushed the furs aside and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She was still wearing her blue calico dress, now wrinkled and crushed from a night of fitful sleep. She smoothed the fabric with trembling hands and walked to the doorway. Talon Greyhawk was sitting on the edge of the low porch, his back to her. He was sharpening an arrow. A small pile of flint chips lay at his feet, catching the light like diamonds. He held the shaft of the arrow with a steadiness that fascinated her, drawing a stone across the head with precise, practiced movements. A small fire crackled in a ring of stones a few yards away, and a battered tin pot sat on a grate above it. The smell of boiling coffee was strong enough to make her mouth water. Talon did not turn around, yet he spoke. "There is coffee. It is strong. It will wake you." Mara hesitated, then stepped onto the porch. The morning air was cool, a deceptive mercy before the midday furnace. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding small in the vastness of the valley. She poured a cup, using a scrap of cloth to hold the hot handle. She stood awkwardly, unsure of the rules of this strange new existence. Was she a guest? A prisoner, a wife? Talon blew the dust from the arrow tip and finally looked at her. In the daylight, the planes of his face were less severe, though his eyes remained guarded. He looked her up and down, not with lust, but with a critical, assessing gaze. "That dress," he said, gesturing with the arrow. "It is good for a shop. It is no good for this land. The thorns will tear it. The sun will burn through it." He set the arrow down and stood up. He moved past her into the cabin, his movements silent. Mara followed him with her eyes. The cabin, which had been a terrifying cage the night before, now looked different in the morning light. It was sparse, yes, but deliberate. On a shelf above the fireplace sat a small statue carved from red stone, a hawk with spread wings. Beside it lay a fan of eagle feathers and a small hand drum made of stretched hide. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. It was a stark contrast to the cluttered chaos of her father's life, where bottles and playing cards were strewn like debris from a shipwreck. Talon returned holding a bundle of soft, tanned leather. He held it out to her. "Put this on," he said. Mara took it. It was a tunic made of buckskin, dyed a soft wheat color, with a long fringe along the sleeves. It looked incredibly soft. I cannot pay you for this," she said automatically, the reflex of the poor kicking in. "I did not ask for payment." Talon said, "Try the fit. It belonged to my sister, many years ago. She was small, like you." Mara held the tunic up to her shoulders. It looked about right. Talon stepped closer, reaching out to check the length of the sleeve against her arm. "Raise your arm," he instructed. She obeyed. His fingers brushed her wrist as he measured the fabric against her skin. The contact was light, barely a graze, but Mara felt a jolt go through her, startling in its intensity. His hands were rough, calloused from work and war, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. Heat flooded her cheeks. Talon froze for a second. He looked at his own hand on her wrist, then at her face. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden, confusing electricity. He pulled his hand back sharply. "It will fit," he said, his voice gruff. "Change. We have work to do." He turned and walked out to the horses, leaving Mara standing in the center of the room, her wrist still tingling where he had touched her. The gray Mustang was named Ghost, and he lived up to the name. He stood perfectly still as Talon approached, but his eyes tracked every movement with intelligent caution. "We do not use saddles for work around the valley," Talon explained. He stood by the horse's shoulder, one hand resting on the animal's withers. "A saddle separates you from the horse. You need to feel him. You need to know what he is going to do before he does it." Mara looked up at the beast. Without a saddle, the horse's back looked impossibly high and slippery. "I have only ever ridden in a wagon, or side saddle on Mr. Crowley's old mare once when I was 12. Side saddle is for women who want to fall off," Talon said flatly. "Here, you ride stride." He laced his fingers together to form a cup. "Step." Mara gathered the buckskin tunic. It was split at the sides for this very purpose. She realized and placed her foot in his hands. He hoisted her up with effortless strength. She scrambled for a grip, her hands burying themselves in the horse's coarse mane. She felt exposed. Her legs were spread wide across the warm, shifting barrel of the horse's body. She could feel the animal's breathing, the twitch of its muscles. "Relax," Talon commanded. He walked to her side. "If you are stiff, you will bounce. If you bounce, you will fall." He reached up and placed his hands on her waist. Mara gasped softly. His grip was firm, his thumbs pressing lightly against her lower ribs to correct her posture. "Sit deep," he murmured, his face level with her thigh. "Let your hips move with him. Do not fight the rhythm." He clicked his tongue, and Ghost began to walk. Mara lurched, gripping the mane tighter. Talon walked beside her, his hand remaining on her waist for a few moments to steady her. The heat of his palm seeped through the leather of the tunic. It was an anchor in the swaying motion of the world. She looked down at the top of his head, at the black hair shining in the sun. He was guiding her, protecting her from a fall. For a girl who had spent her life dragging a drunken father out of gutters, being the one who was held up felt dangerously seductive. "You are doing well," he said, removing his hand. Mara missed the weight of it immediately. Dinner was a disaster. Determined to prove she was not useless, Mara had insisted on cooking the evening meal while Talon tended to the horses. She found a sack of dried beans and a piece of salt pork. Back in town, on a cast-iron stove, she could make a decent stew. But the open hearth was a different beast. The fire was inconsistent, the pot was heavy, and she underestimated how quickly the water would boil away in the dry desert air. When Talon came inside, shaking the dust from his hair, the cabin was filled with the acrid stench of charred food. Mara stood by the fire, holding a spoon, looking at the black, crusty mess in the bottom of the pot. Her eyes burned with smoke and unshed tears of frustration. She braced herself. She waited for the shouting. She waited for the sound of a hand striking a table or a cheek. That was what happened when dinner was ruined in the Quinn household. Talon walked over. He peered into the pot. He sniffed. "The beans are dead," he observed. Mara flinched. "I am sorry. The fire was too hot. I turned my back for 1 minute to get water." Talon looked at her, seeing the way her shoulders were hunched in anticipation of a blow. His expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing through his dark eyes. He took the spoon from her hand. He scraped a bit of the black sludge, examined it, and then walked to the door. He whistled. The 2 camp dogs trotted up. Talon dumped the contents of the pot onto the ground. The dogs wagged their tails and dove in enthusiastically. "At least someone is happy," Talon said dryly. He turned back to her. "We have dried meat, and I will show you how to manage the coals. The fire is like a horse. Mara, you have to watch it, or it runs away with you." He knelt beside her at the hearth. He did not push her aside. He invited her to kneel with him. He took her hand and guided it, showing her how to bank the coals, how to move the pot to the edge where the heat was steady but not aggressive. His arm brushed against hers. His shoulder pressed into her shoulder as they leaned in to inspect the embers. The heat from the fire was intense, flushing her face. But the heat radiating from his body was different. It was solid. It was alive. Mara looked at his profile, illuminated by the orange glow. He was teaching her survival. He was sharing his knowledge, not hoarding it to keep her dependent. "Thank you," she whispered. Talon turned his head. Their faces were inches apart. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He held her gaze for a long second, the air thick with unsaid things, before he cleared his throat and stood up. "Watch the pot," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "I will fetch more wood." 2 days later, Talon took her to the source of everything. They rode up the trail behind the cabin, ascending the red slopes until they reached a hidden plateau. Here, sheltered by a semicircle of towering rocks, lay a pool of water so clear it looked like liquid glass. Green ferns grew in the cracks of the stone, a shocking splash of emerald in the world of rust and ochre. "This is the weeping eye of the mountain," Talon said, dismounting. He knelt by the water and drank from his cupped hands. Mara followed suit. The water was impossibly cold and sweet. "My people camped here for 3 generations," Talon said quietly. He gestured to the faded markings on the rock wall spirals and handprints painted in ochre centuries ago. "Before the Spanish, before the Americans, this water has never run dry." He looked out over the valley below, where the vast expanse of the desert stretched out to meet the violet horizon. "Crowley looks at this land and sees a straight line for his train," Talon said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "He sees iron and steam. He says I'm a poor man because I do not have gold in a vault." He turned to Mara, his eyes fierce. "But look, I have water. I have the bones of my ancestors beneath my feet. I have the wind that speaks the names of the dead. They call me poor, Mara. But standing here, I am richer than any man in that town." Mara looked at him, standing tall against the sky, his hair whipping in the wind. He looked like a king in exile. For the first time, she understood. It wasn't just dirt and rocks. It was a promise he was keeping to ghosts. "It is beautiful," she said softly, "and it is worth fighting for." Talon looked at her, surprised. "Most white people see only emptiness here." "I am not most people," Mara said. "Not anymore, but the world outside the valley was not so understanding. The following week, they had to drive into Red Mesa for supplies. The flour barrel was empty, and they needed salt." As they rode down Main Street, Mara now sitting astride the paint mare with growing confidence, the atmosphere changed. The noise of the town seemed to drop away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Crowley had been busy. He had not just told people that Talon had married Mara. He had twisted the story. He told the church ladies that Talon had bought Mara to be his servant. He told the men at the saloon that Talon had sold out his heritage for a white woman, that he was no longer a warrior, but a traitor to both races. Talon walked with his head high, ignoring the stares. Mara tried to do the same, but it was harder for her. She saw Sarah, a girl she'd worked with at the dress shop. Sarah was sweeping the boardwalk. When she saw Mara, she paused. Mara raised a hand, a tentative smile forming on her lips. "Hello, Sarah," she called out. Sarah looked at Mara's buckskin tunic, then at Talon's back. Her face hardened. She turned around, went inside the shop, and slammed the door. The click of the lock was loud in the quiet street. Mara felt the rejection like a physical slap. Her face burned. She heard a cowboy chuckle from the porch of the saloon. "Look at the squaw woman," someone muttered. "Dressed up just like him." Talon stopped. His hand dropped to the knife at his belt. The tension in his shoulders was a coiled spring. Mara saw the danger. If he fought now, here, he would be arrested or shot. That was what Crowley wanted. She spurred her horse forward, bringing herself alongside him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, right over the muscle that was tensed to draw the weapon. "Talon," she said, her voice clear and loud enough for the watchers to hear. "The flower, please. I want to go home." Home. She had called the cabin home. Talon looked at her hand on his arm. He saw the plea in her eyes, not for her safety, but for his. He took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring. He nodded once. "We get the flower," he said. He did not shake off her hand. He let her keep it there as they rode past the saloon. It was a shield and a claim. She was humiliated by the town. Yes, but walking beside him, absorbing the hatred directed at him, she felt a strange, fierce pride. He was worth 10 of these men, and he was hers. They rode back in silence, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows that stretched ahead like dark fingers. When they reached the corral, Mara was exhausted. The emotional weight of the trip was heavier than the sacks of flour. She swung her leg over to dismount, but her boot caught on a loose stone as she hit the ground. She crumbled, her knee striking the hard earth with a sickening crunch of skin against gravel. "Ah!" The cry escaped her before she could stop it. Talon was there in an instant. He dropped the reins and was at her side, crouching down. "Where?" he demanded. "My knee," she hissed, clutching her leg. "It is just a scrape. I am clumsy." "Sit," he ordered. He helped her hobble to the porch and sat her down on the wooden planks. He went to the water barrel and came back with a wet cloth and a small pot of salve that smelled of pine resin. He knelt between her legs, his movements efficient but gentle. He rolled up the leg of her buckskin trousers. The skin of her knee was angry red, oozing blood where the gravel had torn it. "This will sting," he warned. He pressed the cloth to the wound. Mara sucked in a breath, her hands gripping the edge of the porch. Talon did not look up. He was focused entirely on the task. He cleaned the grit away with painstaking care. Then he took a bit of the salve on his finger and began to apply it to the raw skin. The sting faded, replaced by the cool sensation of the balm and the warmth of his finger. Mara looked down at him. His head was bent, his dark hair falling forward to curtain his face. She could see the strong line of his neck, the pulse beating steadily beneath the bronze skin. He was so close. She could smell him horses, sweat, and that clean desert scent. He finished applying the salve but did not pull away. He remained kneeling, his hands resting lightly on her calf. He looked up. His eyes were dark pools, reflecting the first stars of the evening. His gaze traveled from her knee, up her thigh, over her torso, and settled on her mouth. Mara's heart slammed against her ribs. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Her hands, which had been gripping the wood, relaxed. Her fingers twitched, wanting to reach out, to touch the hair that brushed his cheek. "Come to me with empty hands," he had said. Her hands were empty now. Talon leaned in, just an inch. Mara leaned forward, drawn by a gravity she could not resist. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her lips. It would be so easy to close the gap, to taste the mystery of him. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then, Talon shut his eyes tight, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He exhaled a shuddering breath and pulled back. He stood up abruptly, putting 5 feet of distance between them. "Keep it clean," he said, his voice rough, almost angry. "Dirt will make it fester." He turned his back to her and walked toward the corral, disappearing into the shadows of the twilight. Mara sat on the porch, her knee throbbing, her lips tingling with the phantom memory of a kiss that had almost happened. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering not from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that she hadn't wanted him to stop. The town could call him a savage, but in that moment of restraint, he was the most noble man she had ever known. And that, Mara realized, was far more dangerous to her heart than any weapon he carried. The wind began to rise at dusk, a low moan that quickly escalated into a shriek. By nightfall, the valley was being scoured by a sandstorm that blotted out the stars and turned the air into a choking haze of red dust. The cabin groaned under the assault. The heavy timber beams creaked, and fine grit hissed against the wooden shutters like dry rain. Inside, the air grew thick and hazy despite the closed door. Talon added another log to the fire. The flames danced wildly in the draft, casting long, erratic shadows against the mud brick walls. He looked at Mara. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching the roof with wide, apprehensive eyes. "It will hold," Talon said, his voice calm, cutting through the noise of the wind. "My grandfather built the frame from ironwood. It has stood for 40 years. He sat on the floor near the hearth, the warmest place in the room. He gestured for her to join him. "Come, the heat is better here." Mara hesitated for only a moment before sliding off the bed. She wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders and sat beside him, close enough to feel the radiation of his body heat but not touching. The storm raged outside, isolating them from the rest of the world. In the firelight, the cabin felt like a small boat adrift on a violent ocean. "Did you grow up in storms like this?" Mara asked softly. Talon poked the fire with an iron rod. "I grew up in the open," he said. "We moved with the seasons. The wind was not an enemy then. It was a messenger." He turned his head to look at her. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the deep, sorrowful pools of his eyes. He looked less like the frightening warrior the town whispered about and more like a man carrying a burden too heavy for one set of shoulders. "Tell me," Mara whispered. "Please, everyone tells stories about you. I want to know the truth." Talon looked into the flames. For a long time, she thought he would refuse. Silence was his armor, but the storm seemed to have stripped away some of his defenses. "I was 12 when the soldiers came to the canyon," he began, his voice low and melodic. "They wanted the horses. We refused. It was not a battle, Mara. It was a harvest." Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. She watched his hands strong, scarred hands tighten around the iron rod until his knuckles turned white. "I survived because I was hidden in a crevice of the rock, guarding the colts," Talon continued. "When the smoke cleared, the tribe was gone, scattered to the reservations in the north, or buried in the sand. I was left with nothing but the land and the ghosts." He looked at her then, and the raw pain in his gaze stole the breath from her lungs. "I learned their language," he said bitterly. "I cut my hair. I went to the government office in Santa Fe and I signed their papers. I swore allegiance to a flag that had been dipped in the blood of my kin. I became a citizen. Talon Greyhawk, American, half red, half white, and belonging to neither." "Why?" Mara asked, tears stinging her eyes. "Why did you stay?" "Because this valley is the only thing that remembers them," Talon said. "If I leave, the spirits fade. If I leave." Crowley turns the sacred mound into a gravel pit for his railroad. "I sold my pride to keep the land. Mara, I pay my taxes. I obey their laws. And still, they look at me and see only a savage to be crushed." Mara reached out. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his clenched fist. His skin was hot, feverish. "You are not a savage," she said fiercely. "You are the most honorable man I have ever met." Talon stared at her hand covering his. Slowly, he turned his fist over and interlaced his fingers with hers. The contact was electric. It grounded him. "And you," he murmured, shifting his body to face her. "You were sold by a father who should have protected you. You should hate every man who breathes." "I did," Mara admitted. Her gaze dropped to his mouth. "Until you gave me the knife." The wind howled outside, battering the door, but inside. The air went still. Talon leaned closer. The scent of him wood smoke, rain, and masculinity filled her senses. "Mara," he warned, his voice a rumble in his chest. She did not pull away. She leaned in, closing the small distance between them. Their lips met. It was not like the kisses she had read about in the penny novels. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and fire. Talon groaned low in his throat, his hand coming up to tangle in the hair at the nape of her neck. His mouth was hot, demanding, yet terrifyingly tender. Mara melted against him, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. For the first time in her life, she felt desired not as a possession, but as a woman. The kiss deepened, his tongue brushing hers, sending a shockwave of heat straight to her belly. Then, just as her body began to arch toward him, Talon pulled back. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. His eyes were black with want, pupil blown and intense, but his hands gripped her shoulders, holding her steady. "No," he rasped. "Not like this, not in the storm, when you are frightened and seeking comfort." "I am not afraid," Mara whispered, her lips swollen and tingling. "I promised you," Talon said, his voice ragged. "I will not take you. You must give. And tonight the wind is too loud to hear the truth." He stood up abruptly, moving away from the fire, away from her warmth. He grabbed his buffalo robe and moved to the far side of the room, near the door. "Sleep, Mara," he commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Sleep." Mara lay back on the furs, her body humming with frustrated energy. She touched her lips. He had stopped. He could have taken anything he wanted, and she would have let him. But he had stopped. The storm died before dawn, leaving the world scoured clean and bright. But the peace did not last. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a buggy pulled by two bays rattled up the trail. Silas Crowley sat on the bench, looking impeccably clean in a gray wool suit that defied the dusty reality of the territory. Beside him sat a man Mara did not recognize, a pale, pinch-faced fellow clutching a leather satchel. Talon was in the corral, checking the horse's hooves. He straightened as the buggy halted. Wiping his hands on a rag, he did not walk to meet them. He stood his ground, forcing them to come to him. Mara stepped out onto the porch, her heart thumping. "Good morning, Greyhawk," Crowley called out. Stepping down from the buggy, he adjusted his cuffs. "And Mrs. Greyhawk, I trust the storm didn't rattle you too badly?" "State your business." "Crowley," Talon said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Crowley smiled and gestured to the pale man. "This is Mr. Thaddeus Finch, a surveyor and legal clerk for the Territorial Land Office. We have been reviewing the records. Talon, it seems there is a discrepancy." Crowley pulled a sheaf of papers from the clerk's satchel. "The Uncertified Land Act of 1876, Crowley cited, waving the document. "It states that any homestead claim filed by a person of indigenous extraction prior to 1875 requires a secondary witness of Caucasian descent to verify the boundaries and improvements. Your claim, well, it lacks that signature. My claim was approved by the governor," Talon said, stepping forward. "I have the deed." "An old deed," Crowley corrected. "Laws change. My friend, progress requires paperwork. As it stands, this valley is technically public domain, which means it can be claimed by the railroad for infrastructure." Mara gripped the porch railing. "You are stealing it," she accused. "You are using words to steal what you cannot buy." Crowley looked at her, his eyes cold. "I am offering a solution. Mara, a generous one." He turned back to Talon. "Sign a quitclaim deed. Talon, relinquish the rights to the water and the mound. In exchange, the bank will deed you a house in town, a proper house, with windows and a floor, and $500 in gold. A house in town, Talon repeated. A cage. A home, Crowley insisted. For your wife. Look at her. Talon, do you think she wants to live in the dirt forever? Do you think she wants to be the squaw of a pauper? Talon looked at the papers in Crowley's hand. He walked forward slowly. Crowley smirked, thinking he had won. He held out the pen. Talon took the papers. He did not take the pen, with a slow, deliberate motion. Talon ripped the document in half. Then he ripped it again. He let the pieces flutter to the ground like dead leaves. "Get off my land," Talon said. Crowley's smile vanished. "You are making a mistake. The law is a heavy hammer. Greyhawk, it will crush you." "Then let it come," Talon snarled. "But if you step foot past that fence line again, I will not wait for the law." Crowley stared at him, his face turning a mottled shade of red. He climbed back into the buggy. "You had your chance." Crowley spat. He snapped the reins, and the buggy wheeled around, kicking up dust as it retreated toward town. The confrontation hung over them like a thunderhead. 2 days later, Mara went into town alone to sell some eggs. She needed to see the reality for herself. The atmosphere in Red Mesa had shifted from mockery to open hostility. When she walked past the church, the Reverend stood on the steps, talking to a group of women. "An obstacle to the prosperity of this entire community," the Reverend was saying. "The railroad brings God's civilization. To oppose it is to oppose the natural order, and for a Christian girl to align herself with such stubborn paganism." He stopped when he saw Mara. The women turned. Their eyes were hard, judging. They did not see Mara Quinn, the seamstress. They saw a traitor. "You should tell him to sign Mara," one woman called out. "Don't be a fool. You are holding everyone back." Mara lowered her head and hurried past. She bought her supplies in silence, enduring the rough handling of her goods by the shopkeeper. She realized then that she had no place left here. She was not white enough for the town, and she was not Red Hawk enough for the history of the valley. She was floating in the void. But as she rode back up the trail, seeing the smoke rising from the cabin chimney, she realized she did not care about the town. The town was full of people who smiled while they held a knife behind their backs. Talon had handed her the knife blade first and told her she was free. That night, the air in the cabin was charged with a different kind of energy. Talon sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. He had been silent since Crowley's visit, a brooding presence that filled the room. Mara finished washing the dishes. She wiped her hands on a cloth and turned to look at him. She looked at the scars on his arms, the tension in his jaw. He was ready to fight the whole world for this patch of earth, and he was fighting it alone. She made a decision. She walked to the corner of the room where her bed stood. She sat down and unlaced her boots. Then, she stood up and reached for the hem of her tunic. She pulled the leather garment over her head and laid it on the chest at the foot of the bed. She wore a simple cotton chemise underneath, thin and worn. "Talon," she said. He looked up from the rifle. The weapon clattered to the table as his hands went slack. Mara walked toward him. She did not bring the knife. Her hands were empty, open at her sides. The firelight turned her skin to gold and cast shadows across the curve of her collarbone. Talon stood up slowly, as if he were approaching a wild animal that might spook. "Mara, you said to come with empty hands," she whispered, stopping a foot away from him. "You said to come when I was not afraid." She reached out and placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it hammering, a frantic rhythm that betrayed his stoic face. Her fingers traced the raised ridge of an old scar that ran from his shoulder to his sternum. "I am not afraid of the wind," she said, "and I am not afraid of you." Talon covered her hand with his. His grip was trembling. "Crowley will bring men. This life, it is not safe." "I do not want to be safe," Mara said, stepping closer until her body brushed against his. "I want this. I want you." She looked up into his eyes. seeing the hunger he had kept leashed for so long. "This time, I choose you." Talon let out a sound that was half groan, half prayer. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet. Mara wrapped her legs around his waist, burying her face in the crook of his neck, inhaling the scent of him. He carried her to the bed he had insisted was hers alone. He laid her down among the furs, his body covering hers, a heavy, warm shield against the world. "Mara," he whispered against her throat, his lips trailing fire across her skin. "My heart, my blood." He kissed her, and this time, he did not pull back. The kiss was deep, consuming, a sealing of a pact that went deeper than any paper Crowley could produce. Clothes were discarded in the golden gloom. Skin met skin, friction and heat, the roughness of his calloused hands against the softness of her waist. There was no violence, only a desperate, reverent exploration. In the sanctuary of the cabin, while the world outside plotted their destruction, Mara and Talon forged a bond that could not be broken by laws or banks. They slept entangled, limbs heavy with exhaustion and contentment. But the war did not wait for them to wake. It was the smell that woke Mara. Not the pleasant smell of wood smoke, but the acrid, oily stench of burning pitch. "Talon!" she screamed, sitting up. Talon was already moving. He was out of bed and grabbing his breeches before her eyes had fully adjusted to the gray light of dawn. "The stable!" he shouted. "Through the open window." An orange glow flickered violently. Talon grabbed a blanket and ran out the door. "Barefoot?" Mara scrambled into her tunic and followed him. The corral was a scene of chaos. The small stable structure, little more than a roof on poles where the feed was stored, was engulfed in flames. The horses were screaming, their eyes rolling in terror as they circled the enclosure. "Ghost paint!" Talon roared. Vaulting the fence, the fire had spooked them into a frenzy. The colt was trapped in the corner near the burning hay, kicking wildly at the rails. "Get back! Mara!" Talon yelled over the roar of the fire. He ran toward the colt. A falling beam, wreathed in flame, crashed down, blocking his path. Talon didn't hesitate. He charged through the fire, shielding his face with his arm. He grabbed the colt's halter, his muscles straining as he dragged the panicked animal away from the heat. He slapped the colt's flank, sending it galloping through the open gate to safety. Then he grabbed the other two horses, driving them out into the cool desert morning. Mara ran to the water trough, filling a bucket, but it was useless. The dry wood burned too fast. The stable was gone. Talon stumbled out of the smoke, collapsing onto his knees in the dirt. "Talon!" Mara dropped the bucket and fell beside him. His left arm, the arm he had used to shield his face, was angry and red. The skin was blistered from wrist to elbow. His hair was singed, and his chest heaved with coughing. "I got them out," he rasped, looking toward the horses that stood shivering in the sagebrush. "They are safe." Mara looked at the smoldering ruins of the stable. She saw the distinct tracks of shod horses leading away from the back of the corral tracks that headed straight for town. This was not lightning. This was not an accident. She looked at Talon's burned arm. She touched the raw skin gently, her hands shaking with rage. Crowley had burned the shelter of innocent animals. He had hurt the man she loved. Talon looked at her. The softness of the previous night was gone from his eyes. In its place was a cold, hard resolve, the look of the warrior who had survived the canyon massacre. "He wants a fight," Talon said, his voice like grinding stones. "He thinks fire will make me run." He stood up, swaying slightly, ignoring the pain in his arm. He looked toward the town, where the sun was just beginning to glint off the windows of the bank. "This is not business anymore," Talon said. "This is war." Mara stood beside him. She did not tell him to be careful. She did not tell him to run. She took his good hand in hers and squeezed it hard. "Then we fight," she said. The smoke from the burned stable still hung heavy in the air, a gray shroud that refused to dissipate in the stagnant heat of the afternoon. It was 3 o'clock when the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward the cabin. Talon was sifting through the ashes, his left arm wrapped in a bandage Mara had fashioned from a clean petticoat. He stood up as the riders approached, his face setting into a mask of stone. He knew this rhythm. It was the drumbeat of a war he had fought his entire life. Leading the pack was not Sheriff Bassett, but a new man, a rigid, square-jawed figure named Sheriff Miller, recently arrived from St. Louis with a shiny badge and a belief in the absolute letter of the law. Beside him rode Silas Crowley, looking triumphant, and behind them were 4 deputies with rifles resting across their saddles. Mara stepped out onto the porch. Her heart hammered a frantic warning against her ribs. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and walked down the steps to stand beside her husband. "Talon Greyhawk," Sheriff Miller announced, pulling his horse up sharply. "You are under arrest." Talon did not flinch. "On what charge?" "Arson," Miller said, his voice clipping the syllables, "and assault on a railroad surveyor. Mr. Crowley here has sworn a statement that you set fire to your own property to frame the company, and that you threatened his surveyor with a weapon." "That is a lie," Mara screamed, stepping forward. "Crowley's men burned our stable. We nearly died trying to save the horses." Crowley looked down at her with a look of mock pity. "Hysteria," he said to the sheriff. "The poor girl is terrified of him. He likely forced her to say that. You know how these savages are. Sheriff, they rule by fear." "Step aside, ma'am," Miller ordered. "No," Mara said, planting her feet. "You will not take him. He is the victim here." 2 deputies dismounted. They were big men, smelling of sweat and chewing tobacco. One of them shoved Mara aside with a careless sweep of his arm. She lost her footing in the loose sand and fell hard, scraping her palms. "Mara!" Talon lunged forward, his instinct to protect overriding his caution. The butt of a rifle cracked against the back of his head. Talon stumbled, dropping to one knee. Before he could recover, the deputies were on him. They wrenched his arms behind his back, ignoring the burns on his left forearm. The click of iron handcuffs echoed through the valley like a gunshot. "Outlaw Indian," the deputy sneered, yanking Talon to his feet. "Back to the reservation with you, or the gallows." Mara scrambled up, spitting sand. She saw the blood trickling down Talon's neck. She saw the satisfaction in Crowley's eyes. "You are making a mistake," she cried out to the sheriff. "Look at the tracks. Look at the evidence." "The evidence will be reviewed by a judge in Tucson," Sheriff Miller said stiffly. "Until then, he is in federal custody." They shoved Talon toward a barred wagon that had been waiting at the rear of the procession. He stopped before climbing in and turned to look at Mara. His eyes were dark, intense, communicating a silent message. Stay alive. Do not give up. Then the cage door slammed shut. The procession turned and rode away, leaving Mara standing alone in the cloud of red dust. A few neighbors from the nearest homesteads had gathered at the ridge to watch. They saw the injustice. They saw the woman left behind, but they said nothing. Their silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Mara stood there until the wagon was a black speck against the red cliffs. Tears streamed down her face, carving tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She looked at her hands empty, shaking hands. Then, the wind shifted. It blew down from the sacred mound, carrying a sound. It was not just the whistle of air through stone. It sounded like a drumbeat, low, steady, relentless. Mara looked up at the red rocks where the ancestors of the Red Hawk slept. She remembered Talon's words, "A woman owns her own body. A woman chooses." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The tears stopped. Her eyes, usually the color of the soft sky, hardened into the color of forged steel. She walked into the cabin. She did not go to her sewing basket. She went to the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. She opened it and pulled out the knife Talon had given her, the obsidian blade with the antler handle. She strapped it to her waist. Then she went to the fireplace and took down the small hand drum. She tapped it once. The sound was a heartbeat. "I am not a widow," she whispered to the empty room. "And I am not a victim." She walked out to the corral. She caught the paint mare and swung onto its back, riding not toward the town, but toward the hidden canyons to the north. She needed help. and she knew exactly where to find the kind of people who hated Silas Crowley as much as she did. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky when Mara reached the narrow pass known as Devil's Throat. A figure stepped out from the shadows of a boulder. A rifle was leveled at Mara's chest. "You ride loudly for a white girl," the figure said. It was a woman. She wore buckskin similar to Talon's, but darker, stained with grease and earth. Her hair was braided with leather cords, and her eyes were sharp, assessing. "I am looking for Kaya," Mara said, keeping her hands visible. "Talon sent me." The rifle lowered slightly. The woman stepped into the moonlight. It was Kaya, Talon's cousin, the one he had mentioned in his stories, the only other Red Hawk who had refused to leave the territory, living like a ghost in the Badlands. "Talon is in a cage," Kaya said flatly. "I saw the wagon." "Then help me get him out," Mara said. Kaya laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You are a seamstress. Go back to your needles." "I am his wife," Mara said. She slid off the horse and stood toe-to-toe with the warrior woman. "And I have a plan, but I need a gun. And I need someone who can shoot straight in the dark." Kaya looked at her. She saw the dirt on Mara's face, the knife at her belt, and the desperate fury in her eyes. She nodded slowly. "I can shoot," Kaya said. "But we need more than bullets. Crowley has 6 men guarding that wagon." "I know," Mara said. "That is why we are going to see Miss Alma." Miss Alma's establishment sat on the edge of Red Mesa, a 2-story house with red velvet curtains and secrets buried in every floorboard. When Mara banged on the back door, the heavy-set woman who opened it looked ready to commit murder. But when she saw Mara's face and Kaya lurking in the shadows behind her, she ushered them into the kitchen. Miss Alma was a woman built like a fortress, with a pile of dyed red hair and eyes that had seen every sin a man could commit. She poured 3 glasses of whiskey. "Crowley is squeezing me," Alma said, lighting a thin cigar. "He raised my rent by 50% last week. Says he wants to clean up the town for the railroad. Hypocrite. He is the dirtiest thing in this territory." "He has Talon," Mara said. "They are moving him to the federal prison tonight. If he gets there, he disappears. He dies." Alma exhaled a plume of smoke. "And you want to stop a prison transport? You have lost your mind. Honey." "I need leverage," Mara said. "Crowley is moving fast. He is desperate to sign that land deal. Why?" Alma smirked. She stood up and walked to a loose floorboard under the pantry shelf. She pried it up with a knife and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "Because he is broke," Alma said, slamming the book onto the table. "Crowley has been skimming from the bank's accounts to pay for his land speculation. He bets on land like your daddy bets on cards. If the railroad deal does not go through by Friday, the auditors from St. Louis will find the hole in the books. He goes to jail for embezzlement." Mara touched the ledger. "This is the proof. Every penny," Alma said. "And I have the letters he wrote to the surveyor, bribing him to falsify the boundaries." "Give it to me," Mara said. "If I give you this, and you fail," Alma warned, "he will burn this house down with me inside it." "I will not fail," Mara said. The transport wagon rattled along the winding road that hugged the edge of the canyon. It was past midnight. The air was cool, but the tension was hot enough to blister skin. Sheriff Miller rode in front. 4 deputies rode alongside the wagon. Inside, Talon sat chained to the bench, his head bowing with every jolt of the wheels. They approached the narrowest part of the pass, where the rock walls rose high on both sides, blotting out the stars. High above on the ridge, Mara lay on her stomach, the cold stone pressing against her chest. She held an old Winchester rifle that Kaya had given her. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. "Wait for the signal," Kaya whispered from the darkness to her left. "Below," the lead horse snorted. Kaya let out a sound, a screech that mimicked a mountain lion perfectly. The horse's ears pricked up. They danced nervously. "Now," Kaya hissed. Mara aimed not at the men, but at the kerosene lantern swinging from the side of the wagon. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the canyon. The glass lantern shattered. Burning oil sprayed onto the rear wheel and the dry brush by the roadside. The sudden flare of light and the noise sent the wagon team into a panic. Ambush! Miller shouted, drawing his revolver. Kaya fired from the other side. Her bullet struck the second lantern on the driver's side. The wagon was now bracketed by fire and darkness. The horses reared, screaming. The driver lost the reins. The wagon swerved violently, the rear wheel hitting a rock. With a sickening groan of wood, the wagon tipped onto its side, skidding through the dirt and crashing against the canyon wall. "Hold your fire!" Miller yelled, trying to control his mount. Mara scrambled down the scree slope, slipping and sliding, rocks tearing at her boots. She reached the overturned wagon. Smoke was billowing everywhere. "Talon!" she screamed. "Here!" His voice came from the wreckage. She found him kicking at the wooden slats. The cage door was jammed. The deputies were disoriented, firing blindly into the dark at phantom attackers. Kaya was keeping them pinned down with precise shots that kicked up dirt near their boots. Mara grabbed a heavy rock and smashed the lock of the cage door. It didn't break. She hit it again, screaming with effort. The metal groaned. "Mara, get back!" Talon yelled. "No!" She hit it a third time. The latch snapped. She yanked the door open. Talon crawled out, his hands still cuffed in front of him, blood running down his forehead. He looked at her, his wife, the seamstress, holding a rifle, her face smeared with soot. "Turn around," she ordered. He turned. She pulled the obsidian knife from her belt, with sawing, frantic motions. She attacked the leather connecting the chain to his belt, then wedged the blade into the keyhole of the cuffs. She didn't have the skill to pick it, but she had the leverage to break the cheap mechanism Crowley had used. With a snap, the cuffs sprang open. "Go!" Kaya yelled from the ridge. "They are regrouping!" Talon grabbed Mara's hand. They ran into the darkness of the side canyon, moving like shadows, leaving the shouting and the confusion behind them. They did not stop until they reached the high caves, miles away. Talon leaned against the rock wall, breathing hard. He pulled Mara to him, checking her for wounds. "You," he breathed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You came for me." "I told you," Mara said, breathless, pressing her forehead against his chest. "I am not in debt. I am a partner." Morning brought a dangerous clarity. Crowley knew he had lost his prisoner. He knew his time was running out. He decided to gamble everything on one final hand. Word reached the caves by noon, brought by the old blacksmith who was sweet on Miss Alma. "Crowley is holding a ceremony at the town limit," the blacksmith gasped, wheezing from the climb. 3 o'clock. The railroad superintendent is there. He plans to sign the land over as abandoned territory under the Emergency Act. He has 12 hired guns guarding the perimeter. Talon checked the load in his revolver. He wants to steal it in broad daylight. "He thinks we are running," Mara said. She pulled Miss Alma's ledger from her saddlebag. "He thinks we are halfway to Mexico." "Then we show him he is wrong," Talon said. The ceremony was set up on a wooden platform hastily erected near the church. A table covered in a red cloth held the documents. The railroad superintendent, a stern man named Mr. Sterling, looked at his pocket watch impatiently. Silas Crowley stood by the table, sweating profusely despite the shade of the awning. He smiled, but his eyes darted nervously to the hills. Sheriff Miller stood nearby, looking unhappy and suspicious, but bound by duty to protect the proceedings. "Shall we proceed, Mr. Crowley?" Sterling asked. "My train leaves at 5. Yes, immediately," Crowley said. He dipped the pen in the inkwell. "Just a formality. The land is vacant. The former occupant is a fugitive." Crowley's hand hovered over the paper. The sound of hoofbeats thundered down Main Street. "Not one horse, 4!" The crowd gasped. Mara Quinn rode in the lead, her hair flying loose, the ledger held high in her hand. Talon rode beside her on the gray Mustang, his face fierce paint. Behind them rode Kaya and the blacksmith, shotguns resting on their thighs. "Stop!" Mara screamed, pulling her horse to a rearing halt right in front of the platform. The 12 hired guns raised their rifles. "Hold fire!" Sheriff Miller shouted, stepping in front of the platform. "I want to hear this. He is a fugitive," Crowley shrieked. "Shoot him! Shoot them all! I have the proof," Mara yelled, throwing the heavy ledger onto the table. It landed with a thud, scattering the ink. "Crowley has been stealing from the bank, and here she pulled out a packet of letters. Here are his orders to burn our stable and frame my husband." Mr. Sterling picked up the ledger. He flipped it open. His eyebrows shot up. "Lies!" Crowley lunged for the gun concealed in his coat. "Don't do it, Silas!" a voice called out from the crowd. It was Pike, the gunman Crowley had hired to burn the stable. He stepped out from behind the water trough. Miss Alma had gotten to him, reminding him that Crowley never paid his debts. "He told us to light the fire," Pike said, spitting tobacco juice. "And he told us to lie to the sheriff." Sheriff Miller turned to Crowley. "Is this true?" Crowley looked at the sheriff, then at the railroad man, then at the angry crowd that was beginning to understand they had been played. The mask of the gentleman crumbled. The rat underneath bared its teeth. "It is my land," Crowley screamed. "I bought this town. I own you all." He drew his pistol. He didn't aim at Talon. He aimed at Mara. The crack of the gunshot was deafening. Talon moved faster than thought. He threw himself from his horse, diving in front of Mara's mount just as Crowley pulled the trigger. The bullet caught Talon in the shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the dirt hard. "No!" Mara shrieked. Chaos erupted. Kaya fired her shotgun into the air, scattering the hired guns who were unsure of their paycheck. Crowley, seeing his shot had failed to kill the girl, scrambled for a horse tied to the rail. "Stop him!" Miller shouted. But it wasn't the sheriff who stopped him. Talon, bleeding from his shoulder, rolled onto his back. He raised his revolver. His hand was steady, anchored by a lifetime of survival. Bang! Crowley's horse reared as the bullet struck the dirt inches from its hooves. Crowley was thrown from the saddle, landing in a heap in the dust. Before he could rise, the railroad superintendent, Mr. Sterling, signaled his own private security guards. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward and pinned Crowley to the ground. "Silas Crowley," Sterling said, his voice cold as ice, "you are under arrest for fraud against the Union Pacific Railroad, and I believe the sheriff has a few charges to add." Mara jumped from her horse and ran to Talon. She fell to her knees, pressing her hands against his bleeding shoulder. "Talon," she sobbed. "Talon, look at me." He opened his eyes. He grimaced, but the corner of his mouth turned up in a faint, pained smile. "I told you," he wheezed. "I am hard to kill." He reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek. You ride like a warrior. Mara." The crowd stood silent. The sheriff walked over, looking down at the wounded man and the woman who held him. He looked at the ledger on the table. He looked at Crowley, who was being dragged away in cuffs, screaming obscenities. Sheriff Miller took off his hat. "Get the doctor," he ordered the deputies. "And someone get this man some water." He looked at Talon. "It seems I owe you an apology, Mr. Greyhawk. And perhaps a look at that treaty of yours." Talon squeezed Mara's hand. The sun was setting, bathing the street in the same red light as the cliffs. The war was over. The silence of the town was no longer heavy with judgment. It was heavy with shame. Mara kissed Talon's forehead, her tears mixing with the dust and the blood. They had won, not with money, and not just with guns. They had won because when the world tried to tear them apart, they had chosen to bleed together. The sun had begun to dip below the western ridge by the time the dust on Main Street finally settled. The silence that followed the gunshot was not the terrified hush of the morning, but a heavy, contemplative quiet. Silas Crowley, the man who had held the mortgage on half the town and the fear of the other half, sat in the dirt. His silk suit was torn at the knee, and his hands were manacled behind his back. He was not shouting anymore. He looked shrunken, stripped of the power that had bloated him for so long. Mr. Sterling, the railroad superintendent, stood over him, brushing dust from his own trousers. "You have caused the Union Pacific a great deal of embarrassment, Mr. Crowley." Sterling said, his voice clipping the air like shears. "And you have cost us time. The auditors will be arriving from St. Louis in 3 days. I suggest you have your answers ready." 2 deputies hauled Crowley to his feet. As they marched him toward the jailhouse, a building he had paid to build, the townspeople watched. The spell was broken. The man who had promised them civilization and prosperity was just a common thief with a better vocabulary. "I thought he was helping us," a shopkeeper muttered to his wife. "He said the Indian was in danger." "He lied. Thomas," his wife replied, clutching her shawl. "He lied about everything." Sheriff Miller walked over to where Talon sat on the edge of the water trough. The doctor, a man named Abernathy, who smelled of rubbing alcohol and peppermint, had finished binding Talon's shoulder. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the deltoid, missing the bone. It was painful, but it would heal. Miller held the old treaty document in his hand, the one Mara had thrown onto the table. He looked at it, then at Talon. "I am a man of the law, Mr. Greyhawk," Miller said stiffly. He was trying to salvage his dignity. "I enforce what is written. It appears I was given incomplete information regarding the status of your claim." Talon looked up. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were steady. "And now, this treaty is valid," Miller admitted, tapping the paper. "Signed by the territorial governor in 1868. It grants the Red Hawk family explicit rights to the water source and the burial mound in perpetuity. It seems Mr. Crowley buried this record in the basement of the land office." Miller handed the document back to Talon. It was a gesture of surrender. "The charges against you are dropped," Miller said. "I will have the deputies return your personal effects, and I will post a guard at your property line for the next week to ensure no further accidents occur." "We do not need your guards," Kaya said, stepping forward with her shotgun cradled in her arm. "We can watch our own land." "Let him do it, Kaya," Talon said softly. He looked at the sheriff. "It is his job. Let him do it." Miller nodded once, touched the brim of his hat, and walked away to deal with the mess Crowley had left behind. Mara stood by the head of the gray Mustang, stroking its nose to soothe the animal. She felt a strange numbness in her limbs now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked down at her buckskin tunic. It was stained with sweat, dirt, and her husband's blood. "Mara." The voice was hesitant, cracking on the second syllable. She turned. Jed Quinn stood a few feet away. He looked older than she remembered, though it had been only days since she left. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook, but he was sober. The shock of seeing his daughter in the middle of a gunfight had evidently burned the whiskey out of his system. He stared at her. He looked at the knife at her belt. He looked at the way she stood feet apart, grounded, unafraid. This was not the girl who sat in the back room sewing shirts and hiding money in a tin box. Jed started, then stopped. He took off his hat and crumbled the brim in his hands. "I heard the shooting. I thought, when I saw you ride in, you thought I was dead." Mara finished for him. Her voice was not angry, but it was firm. It lacked the pleading tone she used to use when begging him to come home. "I am sorry, Mara," Jed whispered. Tears welled in his eyes and spilled over into the deep lines of his face. "I never meant for this. Crowley said he would take care of you. He said you would have a house. I thought I was saving you from poverty." "You sold me, Pa," Mara said. She stated it as a fact, plain and simple. "You traded me to clear a debt of $300? Jed flinched as if she had struck him. "I know. God, I know. And I have hated myself every minute since." He took a step toward her, reaching out a trembling hand. "Come home, Mara. I will make it right. I will get a job. I will clean up. We can leave this place." Mara looked at his hand. Then she looked over her shoulder at Talon, who was watching them intently, ready to intervene if she gave the signal, but she didn't give it to me. This was her battle. "I am home, Pa," Mara said. Jed looked confused. "But you live in a shack. You are fighting the whole world out there." "I live in a home where I'm respected," Mara said. "I live with a man who would take a bullet for me, not trade me for a poker chip." She stepped closer to her father, her blue eyes locking onto his watery ones. "I love you, Pa. You are my father, but I am not your caretaker anymore, and I am not your currency. Mara, if you want to be in my life," she continued, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with every word, "then you figure out how to stand on your own 2 feet. No more one last hand. No more bottles. You learn to be a father or you stay away, because I will not let anyone sell me again, not Crowley, and not you." Jed stared at her. He saw the steel in her spine. Steel. He realized she must have forged herself because he certainly hadn't given it to her. He swallowed hard, nodded, and put his hat back on. "I hear you, girl," he choked out. "I hear you." He turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped. He looked small against the vast backdrop of the red cliffs. Mara watched him go. It hurt, a sharp ache in her chest, but it was a clean pain. It was the pain of a bone being set straight so it could finally heal. That evening, the bell of the small wooden church rang. It was not Sunday, but the Reverend felt the need to summon the flock. The meeting was small. Only about 30 people showed up: the shopkeepers, the blacksmith, the school teacher, and a few farmers. The bluster and righteous indignation of the morning were gone. The Reverend stood at the pulpit. He was a man who liked the sound of his own voice, but tonight he seemed at a loss for words. He looked at the empty front pew where Silas Crowley used to sit, always leaving a $5 gold piece in the collection plate. "Brothers and sisters," the Reverend began, clearing his throat. We have been led astray." He adjusted his spectacles. "It is easy to believe that prosperity is a sign of God's favor, and it is easy to believe that those who are different from us are enemies. Silas Crowley played on those beliefs. He used our fear. He used our greed." A woman in the back row stood up. It was Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, who had been one of the loudest critics of Mara's marriage. "But they are still savages. Reverend," she said, though her voice lacked its usual venom. "That girl, she was shooting a gun. She was dressed like a wild thing. She was defending her husband." The blacksmith rumbled from the corner. "And she was defending the truth, which is more than any of us did." The room went quiet. The blacksmith was a big man, respected for his honesty. "We stood by while Crowley burned their stable." The blacksmith continued. "We watched him frame a man for a crime we knew he didn't commit. I saw the smoke that morning. I knew it wasn't Talon, but I said nothing because I owed the bank money." He looked around the room. "That is not civilization. That is cowardice." The Reverend nodded slowly. "We must do better. The treaty stands. The land belongs to the Red Hawk family. We do not have to like them. We do not have to invite them to tea, but we must respect the law, and we must stop using the language of hate. We are neighbors, whether we chose it or not." There was a murmuring of assent. It wasn't a revolution. Prejudices ran deep, and they wouldn't vanish overnight. But the fever had broken. The town of Red Mesa was beginning to wake up. 3 miles away, in the shadow of the sacred mound. The night was cool and still. The cabin was dark, save for the glow of the hearth. Kaya moved efficiently around the small space, boiling water and tearing clean strips of linen. She was humming a low, rhythmic tune, a song of healing. Talon sat on a wooden stool near the fire, his shirt removed. The bandage the doctor had applied was functional, but Kaya insisted on checking it. "The white doctor sews like a blind woman," Kaya muttered, inspecting the stitches. "But the wound is clean. The bullet went through." She applied a poultice of crushed yarrow and sage to the entry and exit wounds. Talon winced, but did not make a sound. Mara stood by the basin, washing the dust from her face and arms. The cool water felt like a baptism. She scrubbed away the gunpowder residue, the blood, the fear. When she dried her face and turned around, she saw Talon watching her. Kaya finished tying the fresh bandage. She patted Talon's good shoulder. "I will sleep in the lean-to tonight," Kaya said, gathering her herbs. "The horses need watching, and you two have things to say that do not need a cousin's ears." She picked up her rifle and slipped out the door. closing it softly behind her. Mara walked over to Talon. She picked up a damp cloth and gently wiped a smear of soot from his cheek. He closed his eyes at her touch, leaning his head slightly into her hand. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. "Only when I breathe," he joked weakly, opening his eyes. "Then stop breathing," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Talon reached out with his right hand and took hers. He pulled her closer until she was standing between his knees. He rested his forehead against her stomach. "I thought I lost you," he murmured. "When Crowley fired, I saw you fall." "I didn't fall," Talon said, his voice muffled against her tunic. "I dove." "There is a difference." He looked up at her. "You rode into town. You stood in front of 12 guns. You are a foolish woman." "Mara Quinn?" "Greyhawk," she corrected. Mara Greyhawk. The name hung in the air, cementing the reality of what they had fought for. It wasn't just a marriage of convenience anymore. It was a marriage of blood and fire. Later, when the moon was high and painting the valley in silver, they walked out to the ledge overlooking the canyon. Talon moved stiffly, his arm in a sling, but he refused to stay in bed. He needed to see the land. He needed to know it was still there. They sat on the flat rock where they had first shared the truth about his past. The wind was gentle tonight, carrying the scent of blooming cactus flowers. Below them, the valley stretched out, vast and silent. The railroad would still come, nothing could stop that. But it would curve. It would bend around the sacred mound. It would respect the boundary. Talon took a deep breath, savoring the air. "My father used to tell me that a warrior's heart has no room for anything but the fight," he said, looking at the stars. "He said that if you let softness in, you become weak. You hesitate, and if you hesitate, you die." He turned to look at Mara. Her profile was illuminated by the moonlight, soft yet strong. "I believed him," Talon confessed. "For years, I lived like a stone. I protected this land because it was my duty, but I felt nothing but the weight of it." Mara turned to face him. "And now," Talon said, reaching for her hand. "I realized he was wrong. Today, when I saw you riding toward me, I was terrified. More terrified than I have ever been in battle." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "But that fear, it made me faster. It made me stronger. You did not make me weak. Mara, you gave me something to fight for." Mara felt a lump in her throat. "I came here as a piece of property," she whispered. "I was so scared. I thought my life was over." "And now?" Talon asked, echoing her question. Mara looked at the cabin behind them. The windows were dark, but it felt warm. It felt safe. "I will stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because of the debt. I will stay as the keeper of this house, if you want me." Talon looked at her. The stoic mask that he had worn since the day she met him. The mask of the poorest man. The outlaw. The savage cracked and fell away completely. Slowly. A smile spread across his face. It was not the cynical smirk he gave Crowley. It was not the polite, guarded nod he gave the sheriff. It was a genuine, radiant smile that reached his dark eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. It transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. "If I want you," he laughed softly, a sound of pure joy. "Mara, you are the fire in my heart. You are the rain in my desert. Without you, this is just a pile of rocks." He leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, mindful of his wound, but it held the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. "Then let us go home," Mara whispered against his lips. "We are home," Talon replied. They sat there for a long time, watching the moon climb higher. The train whistle blew in the far distance, a lonely sound echoing off the canyon walls. But it no longer sounded like a threat. It was just a noise in the night, powerless against the silence of two people who had found their peace. The seasons in the Arizona territory did not change with a whisper. They changed with the weight of a shifting mountain. 1 full year had passed since the dust had settled on Main Street, and Red Mesa was no longer the same town. The railroad had come, just as Silas Crowley had promised, but it had not come as a conqueror. The iron rails, gleaming black in the harsh sun, did not slice through the heart of the valley. Instead, they curved in a wide, respectful arc 3 miles to the north, skirting the edge of the red cliffs and avoiding the sacred spring entirely. The engineers from the Union Pacific had grumbled about the cost of the diversion, but the Treaty of 1868, held firm by a new sheriff and a watchful community, had proven harder to break than granite. The cabin in the shadow of the mound had changed too. It was no longer just a bachelor's shelter of mud and logs. It had grown. Talon and the old blacksmith, working side by side through the cooler months of autumn, had added a second room built of planed lumber. It was a marriage of architecture that mirrored the marriage inside. On the wall above the hearth, the stone hawk totem still watched over the room, but now it hung beside a small, simple wooden cross. A loom, built from sanded oak, stood in the corner where the sunlight was strongest. Mara sat at that loom, the rhythmic clack whoosh of the shuttle marking time. She was 19 now, nearing 20, but the girl who had trembled in a dress shop was gone. The woman who sat there had skin the color of roasted almonds, darkened by hours in the sun. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid, though a few strands always escaped to frame her face. She paused in her work, her hand resting instinctively on the swell of her stomach. She was 5 months pregnant. The child was active today, turning and kicking as if eager to join the world. Mara smiled, a soft, private expression that smoothed the lingering sharpness of her eyes. She was not the innocent girl sent to pay a debt. She was the matriarch of this valley, a woman who had carved a place for herself out of rock and resistance. Outside, the sound of shouting and laughter drifted through the open window. Mara stood up, her movements slower but filled with a heavy grace, and walked to the door. In the flat clearing near the new corral, Talon Greyhawk stood in the center of a circle of children. There were 6 of them, boys and girls from the scattered families of the Red Hawk Band who still lived in the hidden canyons, and 2 curious children from the town who had wandered out to see the Indian school. Talon held a bow, but he was not firing it. He was holding a piece of paper. "The bow protects you from the mountain lion," Talon said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "But this protects you from the wolves in suits." He knelt down so he was eye level with a small boy named Little Bear. "Read the line, just as I taught you." The boy squinted at the paper. Article 4. The water and the land surrounding the mound shall remain inviolate. "Good," Talon said, nodding. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember those words. Arrows can break, iron can rust, but the law, when you know how to wield it, is a shield that covers us all." Mara leaned against the door frame, watching him. He wore a clean cotton shirt tucked into his buckskins, and his hair was tied back neatly. He was no longer the poorest man in town, the outcast who haunted the edges of society. He was a teacher. He was a pillar. The burns on his arm had healed into silvery scars, badges of the fire he had walked through to keep them safe. He looked up, sensing her gaze. The stern mask of the instructor melted away, replaced by a warmth that was reserved only for her. He nodded, a silent communication that said, "I will be in soon." That evening, the smell of roasting venison and sage filled the expanded kitchen. The table was set for 3. A knock came at the heavy oak door. It was a hesitant sound, lacking confidence. "Come in, it is unlocked," Mara called out. The door opened, and Jed Quinn stepped inside. He looked different. The bloated puffiness of cheap whiskey was gone from his face, leaving him looking leaner, older, but sharper. His hands were stained black with soot and oil. He was working as a striker for the blacksmith now, swinging a hammer 10 hours a day. It was brutal work for a man of his age, but it was honest work. He took off his hat, twisting it in his hands. "Good evening, Mara." Talon, who was slicing bread at the counter, nodded. "Jed, wash up. The water is in the basin." It was a simple command, but it held a world of acceptance. A year ago, Talon would have looked at Jed with contempt. Now, there was a truce. Jed washed the soot from his hands, scrubbing until the water turned gray. He sat at the table, looking around the room with a mixture of awe and shame. He looked at the loom, at the food, at his daughter's stomach. "The blacksmith says the new plowshares are ready," Jed said, making conversation. "Hard as steel I have ever worked. They will turn this earth like butter." "We will need them," Mara said, placing a platter of meat on the table. "We are planting more corn in the spring and squash near the creek." Jed looked at her. "You have done, well, Mara, you have made a life here." "We made a life," Mara corrected gently, glancing at Talon as he sat down. They ate in a comfortable silence for a while. Then, Jed cleared his throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a bank draft. "It is not much," Jed said, pushing it across the table toward Mara. $5. It is my first month's savings. I know it does not make up for 300, but it is a start." Mara looked at the paper. $5, a year ago? That money would have gone to the Golden Nugget Saloon before the ink was dry. She did not push it back. To refuse him would be to deny him his dignity. But she did not put it in her pocket, either. "Keep it, Pa," Mara said. Jed's face fell. "Mara, please, I need to pay you back." "You do not owe me money," Mara said firmly. "That debt is gone, burned. If you want to give something to this family, you put that money aside, you save it, and when this baby comes," she rested her hand on her belly, "you buy your grandchild a rocking horse, a good one, made of oak." Jed stared at her, his eyes misting over. He swallowed hard, fighting the emotion that threatened to choke him. "A rocking horse," he whispered. Yes, I can do that. The best one in the territory." "And Pa," Mara added, her voice dropping to a serious register. "You are welcome at this table. Always, but if I ever smell whiskey on you, even one drop." You won't," Jed vowed, sitting up straighter. "I gave my word to the blacksmith, and I'm giving it to you. I am done with the cards. I am done with the bottle." Mara smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. "Then eat your venison. It is getting cold." After dinner, Jed left to walk back to his room behind the smithy. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. Mara walked out to the porch and sat on the wide wooden step. The wind blew up from the valley, cooling the sweat on her neck. It carried the scent of the horses and the sweet, dry perfume of the desert at dusk. She heard Talon's boots on the floorboards behind her. He stepped out, smelling of wood smoke and leather. He sat down on the step below her, so that his back rested against her legs. It was their ritual, the quiet time before the dark. Talon sighed, a long exhalation that released the tension of the day. He leaned his head back, resting it against her knee. Mara ran her fingers through his hair, untying the leather thong so the black strands fell loose over his shoulders. "The boy, Little Bear," Talon said quietly. "He asked me today if I was ever afraid." "What did you tell him?" Mara asked. "I told him the truth." Talon said, "I told him that a man who is not afraid is a fool, but a man who lets fear rule him is a slave." He turned his body, shifting so he could kneel on the step. He faced her, his eyes level with her chest. His gaze dropped to the curve of her belly beneath the tunic. The expression on his face softened into something so tender it made Mara's heart ache. The warrior who had faced down Crowley's guns, the man who had ridden through fire, looked at her unborn child with a reverence that bordered on worship. He reached out his large, calloused hands and placed them on either side of her stomach. The heat from his palms seeped through the fabric. "He is strong tonight," Talon murmured, feeling the movement beneath his hands. "She," Mara corrected with a smile. "I feel it is a girl. She has my stubbornness." "A girl with your fire and my land," Talon mused. "The world is not ready for her." He leaned forward and pressed his cheek against her belly. He closed his eyes. For a long moment, he just breathed, listening to the second heartbeat that drummed within her. Then, he began to speak. It was not English. It was the liquid, rhythmic tongue of the Red Hawk people. He spoke in a whisper, the words vibrating against her skin. It was a blessing. He was telling the child about the wind, about the mountains, about the honor of the blood that flowed in its veins. He was promising protection. He was promising a home. Mara did not understand the words, but she understood the music. She rested her hand on his head, tears pricking her eyes. This was the victory. Not the treaty, not the house, not the defeat of Crowley. This, the restoration of a family, the breaking of the cycle of loss. The following Sunday, a small procession made its way up the winding trail to the sacred mound. There was no priest, there was no congregation. It was just the people who mattered. Kaya walked in front, carrying a bowl of smoking sage. The blacksmith walked behind her, looking uncomfortable but respectful in his Sunday suit. Miss Alma was there, puffing and complaining about the rocky terrain in her high-buttoned shoes, but refusing to be left behind, and Jed Quinn brought up the rear, carrying a small wooden box. They reached the top of the plateau. The spring bubbled quietly, the water clear and eternal. The red rocks stood like sentinels against the blue sky. Talon and Mara stood in the center of the circle. "We are here to witness," Talon said. His voice was solemn, not to ask for permission from a god in a building, but to make a promise to the earth that feeds us. He turned to Mara. In his hands, he held a leather cord strung with 3 vibrant red hawk feathers. "In my tribe," Talon said, "feathers are earned. They are given for acts of bravery, for wisdom, for protecting the people." He stepped closer to her. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not brush it away. "You faced the guns," Talon said. "You faced the fire. You faced the judgment of your own people, and you did not back down. You saved this land as much as I did." He tied the leather cord into her hair, the red feathers standing bright against the honey-colored strands. "I name you Keeper of the Fire," Talon said. "You are Red Hawk. Your blood is mixed with this earth." Mara touched the feathers. She felt a weight settle onto her shoulders. But it was a good weight. It was the weight of belonging. She turned to her father. "Pa!" Jed stepped forward with the wooden box. He opened it. Inside lay a single playing card. It was the Jack of Diamonds, the card that had been the face of the debt, the symbol of the game that had cost him his daughter. Mara took the card. It felt flimsy in her hand, a piece of paper that had once held the power to destroy lives. She knelt down at the base of the largest rock, where the earth was soft. She used her hands to dig a small hole. "This is old life," Mara said, her voice steady. "This is the fear. This is a shame. It ends here." She placed the card in the hole. She covered it with the red dirt, patting it down firmly. "Buried," she whispered. "Gone," Miss Alma sniffled loudly, wiping her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Well," she said, her voice cracking, "that is about the most beautiful funeral I have ever seen." Kaya stepped forward and wafted the sage smoke over Mara and Talon. "The spirits see you," she said. "They are pleased." The group walked back down the trail as the sun began to set, leaving Talon and Mara alone on the ridge. The sky was turning a brilliant, bruising violet, streaked with gold. Far in the distance, miles away across the desert floor, a steam whistle blew. It was the evening train, heading west to California. A year ago, that sound would have made Talon tense. It would have sounded like an invasion. Now, it was just a sound, a distant reminder of a world that was rushing by, too busy to notice the small, sacred victory in the valley. Mara leaned into Talon's side, her arm wrapping around his waist. He pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Do you hear it?" Talon asked. "The train?" Mara asked. "No," Talon said. "The silence. Peace." Mara listened. She heard the wind in the sagebrush. She heard the cry of a hawk circling above. She heard the steady beat of Talon's heart against her ear. "I hear it," she said. Then, Talon did something unexpected. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, joyous sound that echoed off the canyon walls, startling the hawk. "We beat them, Mara," he said, looking down at her with shining eyes. "We beat the bank. We beat the railroad. We beat the devil himself." Mara laughed too, the sound bubbling up from her chest, free and unburdened. "We did. We really did." Their laughter drifted over the valley, mixing with the wind. It was the sound of a new West, not the West of guns and greed, but the West of endurance. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Red Hawk Valley in a final, glorious glow. The warrior and the seamstress stood together, watching the stars come out one by one. She was no longer a debt to be paid. He was no longer a savage to be feared. They were simply a man and a woman who had built a fortress out of love and dared the world to try and tear it down. And the world, wise enough to recognize true strength, had stepped aside. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Mara and Talon as much as I enjoyed writing it. It is a tale about finding strength in the most unlikely places and choosing your own family. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts on the ending and connect with you. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And do not forget to hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to this old storyteller. Thank you, and safe travels on your own trails.